So today we're going to have the final lecture on recognition, and we'll be talking about event recognition rather than the other forms we've been talking about before. If you think about mostly what we've done in this course, I sometimes describe it as the perception of noun-like properties. So, for example, if you recognize a car or a person or a desk, those are all nouns. But we also perceive actions in the world. So if you distinguish between somebody walking or running, for example, or jumping or skipping or hopping, think of all the action verbs that we can observe in people and describe. That's also a big problem in perception that we have to understand. Now, the study of that has gone through an interesting history. So back in the 1970s, this is, you remember when I talked to you about Gunnar Johansson and the point light walkers at the very beginning of the class? Well, Johansson inspired a lot of people, and this area of event perception and event recognition was hugely popular in the 70s and 80s. And much of the research that I'm going to tell you about today stems from that period. However, it's recently been making a comeback. And so there are a number of quite recent studies, especially by a guy at Yale, a guy by the name of Brian Shaw. And Alish Martinez, I've mentioned a few times in this course, is also getting this problem from the perspective of computer vision. All right, if you think about it, there are lots of practical applications for being able to identify events. So imagine you've got a camera and you're watching people move through campus. If you could identify that one person is stalking another one, you might want to alert authorities about that. All right, so if you can identify that sort of action reliably, unfortunately computers don't even come close to that, but maybe someday they will. But this is a story about event perception. Now, this is sort of a follow-up to just what I said, but if you think about it, there are two kinds of invariants that we have to worry about. So one is, let's say when you recognize me, Professor Todd. So I come in here different days, I have different clothes on, I might get a haircut, I might wear my glasses or not wear my glasses, I have different facial expressions. So whatever it is that constitutes Professor Todd for you is fairly abstract. It's abstract enough that it can tolerate all those changes in the way that you might happen to view me. And it's those changes, by the way, that make recognition so difficult. You can think of event perception as the converse of that, right? So an action, take running, for example, right? I could be running, you could be running, you could be running, your dog could be running. You could have a cartoon character that's running. So the ability to identify that action is invariant over different entities that might be performing that action. And that's one of the things that we're going to try and understand. So I sometimes refer to these as structural invariants, properties of an object that remain constant under different kinds of change. So I'm Professor Todd, whether I'm running, walking, skipping, or jumping. Transformational invariants, properties of a pattern of change that remain constant over different objects. So running is running whether I'm doing it, you're doing it, or you're doing it. Okay, so let me tell you about a few experiments on this, and I'll give a little bit of backstory to this one. This is a model I did, one of my earliest papers, was published in '82. And what inspired it was, remember we talked a couple times ago about structure for motion. I was giving a seminar with my postdoc advisor on the kinetic depth effect. And I bragged to the class that the next week I would come up with a computational model of that. And I was impetuous in my youth. Nobody in their right mind would do that because it's hard to come up with models. To claim you're going to do it in a week is sort of ridiculous. So I spent much of the week, my wife was making fun of me. This is before we had computers. And, I had pages scribbled with equations and nothing is coming out. And finally I said, this is ridiculous. And I sat down and my wife was just laughing at me because I've got these big piles of rumpled up paper on the floor from my failures to do this model. And so I said, well, all right, I'll relax. So I sat down, smoked a joint, and there was a TV commercial, I don't really remember, from CBS used to have this logo. CBS has a logo that's an eye. And so they had this little dot that moved around in an elliptical path, and then a circle formed in the center. And so when I saw that dot moving around an elliptical path, I shouted, "Eureka!" I didn't actually shout that, but I all of a sudden saw the solution, and I was able to develop the model in about 20 minutes after this realization. This is the power of marijuana. So the basic idea here is when you have a point, you have an object that's rotating about a fixed axis, and you look at its optical projection, the projections of all those points will form an elliptical trajectory in the image plane. All right, so the idea here is this is an ellipse. You can imagine this is how a point is moving in the projection of a rotating object. And there are a couple parameters we use to define ellipse. There's the major axis, I've labeled that as A. There's a thing called eccentricity, which is the ratio between the major axis and the minor axis. The point can rotate at different frequencies. It can have different orientations, the ellipse can. And so these are the parameters for defining a trajectory. And what I realized at that moment is that there's some pretty tight constraints on the pattern of trajectories you get if the object is a rigid motion. So in particular, all points will move in an elliptical trajectory. All the trajectories have the same eccentricity. This assumes parallel projection, by the way. I'll generalize this in a second. The minor axes of all the trajectories must be collinear, and all points must traverse their trajectories at the same frequency. So here are some examples of this. These are dots at different moments of time for this bent coat hanger here that's rotating in depth. And this is a viable pattern of trajectories of the vertices of this figure as it's rotating in depth. If you have something like this, where the ellipses don't line up with one another, this is not a possible rigid motion. Or if you have something like this, where the trajectories all have different orientations, this is not a possible rigid motion. Similarly, imagine rotating around, right? And my head's rotating at one frequency and my arm's rotating and my torso's rotating at a different frequency. That would not be a healthy thing to do. All right, so all the points have to rotate with the same frequency. And similarly, under orthographic projection, they all have to have the same eccentricity. This is not true, however, under perspective. I'll talk more about that shortly. So here's what happens under perspective. So here we have relatively little perspective. We kick it up, we have a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And as you can see, the eccentricity of the trajectories change with respect to one another. Now, how many of you, do they still have that toy called Spirograph? All of what I told you just far assumes that the object's rotating about a fixed axis. If you have a variable axis, then things get much more complicated. Then you get trajectories that look like this, right? These are the kinds of things you make with a spirograph. So spirograph, right, you have a little wheel inside a big wheel, and you can connect those things in various ways and get very complicated patterns with it. So this model, if you should believe it, predicts that fixed axes of rotation should be a lot easier to judge rigidity than having moving axes of rotation. So here is an example of rigid motion. This is where all the points moving at the same frequency, the trajectories are all parallel to one another. Does it look rigid? How many of you think it looks rigid? All right, compared to this one, how many of you think this looks rigid? All right, so this violates the constraint where the trajectories all have different orientations. That's not possible for a rigid motion. How about this one? Rigid or non-rigid? What's making this non-rigid?
A little dangly thing.
So this guy is rotating at a much faster frequency than this guy is down here. How about this one? This almost looks like a guy swimming. Rigid or non-rigid? And then finally, or not quite finally, this one. This is where you have precession, or a moving axis of rotation. This one's sort of hard to judge. So here are the different categories. And here are the results. So what we did is we showed subjects moving objects, and they simply had to judge a confidence rating. How confident are you that it's rigid, or how confident are you that it's non-rigid? And I take it back. In this experiment, we probably just did, is it rigid or non-rigid? So it was a binary choice. And this shows the percentage of the correct responses. Notice that for the fixed axis of rotation, they're almost 100% accurate. And that the accuracy falls off when the axis rotates. The other interesting case is this one. They don't do very well with the variable eccentricity. That's this case. Their performance is, I'm surprised I don't have an example of that. Appears like I don't. Now, one of the things about this model, which is important, right? So whenever you have a model, it's the first thing you want to do. You want to try and test it. Is this consistent with what humans are doing? So there's one aspect of these data that are consistent, namely that having a moving axis of rotation hurts your ability to distinguish rigid and non-rigid motion. But the other thing about this model is that if you're comparing trajectories, you need a lot of information to do that. You need to see the whole trajectory, or at least half of the trajectory, in order to define the ellipse. So in order to test that, what we did is we varied the frame rate. So we could have a low frame rate with different degrees of oscillation, or a high frame rate with different degrees of oscillation. And notice the speed of rotation doesn't seem to matter very much, but you need to have at least 90 and preferably 180 degrees before you actually maximize your performance. Right, so it takes 180 degrees to define the whole ellipse of the trajectory. And if you add a variable rotating axis of rotation, then performance drops off precipitously. And in that case, even with 270 degree rotation, you don't get perfect accuracy. All right, so this is one possible model, which is an analysis of image trajectories for how you would distinguish between rigid and non-rigid motion. All right, so this is an example of an event. Is the motion rigid or is the motion non-rigid? And this is a model for how you do that. Now, I've already told you about another model in a different context, and that was the one developed by Ullman, where you decompose rotation about two different axes. And what Ullman showed is that you can get rid of the motion about the line of sight And if you do that, and you rotate one image relative to another one, if the motion is rigid, through that rotation, you can create a set of parallel trajectories. So if you could rotate one image with respect to the other and get a parallel set of trajectories, then according to Ullmann, it has a rigid interpretation. If you can't, then the motion must be non-rigid. All right, everybody clear on that?
Can you explain it a little bit more?
I'm sorry?
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So remember in Ullmann's theory of structure for motion, he did it in a special coordinate system. So there's an old theory by Euler that shows you can take any rotation of an object. So let's say I'm rotating my arm like this. So you can take any rotation like that, and instead of describing it as a rotation about this axis, you could say, all right, I'll do a combination of rotation about a vertical axis and a rotation about an axis like so. And what Euler proved is you take any two axes you want, and by doing rotations about those two axes, you can create the equivalent of a single rotation about any other axis. You just have to take my word on this, all right? Now, what Ullmann did in his model is he said, all right, since I can pick any two axes I want to describe any rotation, let's pick these two. I'll take one about an axis in the image plane, and I'll take one about an axis along the line of sight. Now, why is it so clever to use those two axes? The reason it's so clever is this one you can undo, right? So rotation about an image, rotation about an axis that's in the line of sight, the points in the image just move in a circle. All right, so if that's the case, then if I rotate one image relative to another, I should be able to create a pattern where the trajectories are all parallel to one another. You can do that, guaranteed, if it's a rigid motion. If it's not a rigid motion, most of the time, you won't be able to achieve this. And so this is done algebraically. You're just solving a bunch of simultaneous equations to make those things parallel to one another. But in some cases, there's no solution. And so that would be the indication that there's no possible rigid interpretation here. Now, there's some rigid motions that Ullmann's model can't detect. A good example would be this one. All right, so you notice that all these points are moving in parallel trajectories. So they pass Ullmann's test, but it doesn't look rigid. All right, so Ullmann's model will detect most non-rigid motions, but it won't detect all of them. And that's going to be a way that we can help maybe tease apart which of these models is more relevant to human perception. Now, finally, there's one other model I'll tell you about. This is, well, let's forget about this model. I won't ask you to know about this one. This is another kind of trajectory model, but it's in a slightly different space. But let's ignore this for the time being. So we have Ullmann uses two-frame motion sequences, cannot detect certain types of non-rigid motion. We have Todd uses image plane trajectories and requires a large number of frames, does not work with moving axes of rotation unless the effects of those motions are removed. And then finally, we have a model by Hogevorst, also requires a large number of frames. It also requires that any rotations in the image plane be removed. So the predictions of these two models are basically the same. So just think about the Ullmann one and the Todd one. So the way that we test this is the following. So we have a rigid rotation. That's this case right here. As everything's moving in parallel trajectories. We have this variable f x offset. So here the trajectories are parallel, but they're not aligned with each other. So Ullmann's model cannot detect this non-rigid motion. And then we have variable orientation. Ullman's model detects this one just fine. So we have two different types of non-rigid motion, one that Ullman can detect and one that Ullman cannot detect. And then we have the Todd model, but the Todd model requires, Ullman can detect this with just two views. The Todd model, whatever non-rigid motion it detects, you need a whole trajectory's worth of information. So two basic predictions. Can any of these be detected in two views? If they can, my model can't account for that. The other prediction is there a difference between this kind of non-rigid motion and that kind of non-rigid motion? All right, my model says you can detect either of these if you have sufficient number of views. Ullman's model can detect this one but can't detect that one. So here we have some data. This is from, why didn't I cite this paper? This is from a PhD thesis of one of my students named Vic Parati. And so what we did is we varied the extent of rotation in degrees. So 360 degrees means you see the whole rotation, you see the whole trajectory. Or we could have 270, 180, or 90, or something much less than that. And we also have the different kinds of motion. So we have rigid motion, that's these solid black lines. We have variable orientation, that's the diamonds. And then we have variable x offset, forget the constant velocity, and variable frequency. So these three are all non-rigid motions that would be invisible to Ullman's model. Ullman's model can detect this one. All right?
Did you say can't?
Yeah.
Did you say can't or can?
Ullman's model can detect this one. It cannot detect these three. And when it detects it, it can detect it in just two views. My model can detect all of them, but it only can do it if you have a large chunk of the trajectory. So let's look at what happens. So first of all, suppose you only have two views. Subjects rate all of these to be rigid. However, this case they rate as non-rigid. So check that up to Ullman. All right? So Ullman's model says, I can get this one, I can't detect these should all look rigid, and I can make that distinction with only two views. So if I only give the subjects two views, that's exactly what they do. However, let's say we give them more views. We give them a full 360 degrees. Now, they can distinguish these from rigid, but notice they don't look quite as non-rigid as this one does. Right? So everybody judges this one as they're 100% certain there's just no way that thing is rigid. These they're not so certain about. It's sort of intermediate between rigid and non-rigid, if there is such a thing. All right, so what these data suggest that whatever we're doing, Ullman's probably got a better picture of it than my model does. But Ullman's model can't account for these data points right here. It accounts for all this stuff, but the trajectory model does a better one. So there are non-rigid motions that we can identify as non-rigid, which his model can't detect. However, what these data also show is that those non-rigid motions don't look as non-rigid as the ones that Ullman's model can detect. Any questions about this before I move on? Yeah?
So what after 90 degrees it doesn't change at all?
I'm sorry?
After that the slope just like they're pretty same.
Yeah, so they're rating all these the same, largely, with a small number of views. And these look very different. As the trajectory pans out, you start to get a separation between the rigid ones and the non-rigid ones.
That's following your model?
That's consistent with my model. So my model says you need a big chunk of the trajectory in order to do that. But on the whole, Ullman's model, I mean, there's some things my model can account for that his can't, but I think his model also is capturing a larger chunk of the data that my model can account for, namely that two-view performance. Any other questions? So, like many other things we've seen in this course, right, there's no reason why you only have one mechanism to do something. We've seen lots and lots and lots of examples where you need multiple models to explain human perception. If one model fails in one situation and another model fails in a different situation, the best way to resolve that is have both of them. And it looks like however we detect rigid and non-rigid motion, that's how things worked out. All right, let's switch to a different problem. Somebody tell me what you see there. Let's pick on you this time. What do you see?
Looks like legs that are walking, but like really weird.
Really weird. You all agree this looks like walking, but really weird? Maybe a bug-like walking?
It's like an exaggerated jazz walk.
I'm sorry?
It's like an exaggerated jazz walk.
I'll tell you how I made this in a second. Let me try this website here. I suspect it's not going to work, but it's too bad. This was a nice website. Yeah. C'est la vie. All right, there's another backstory to this experiment. So back in probably the early 80s, Disney had re-released the movie Fantasia. Have any of you seen that movie? And my wife decided that it would really be great to go together and see Fantasia. It was one of the most boring movies I've ever seen. Though I did like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, was pretty cool. But there was one scene in there that drove me crazy. And it was a bunch of guys, a bunch of centaurs that were walking around in a fountain. And I'm watching this scene and I'm going, there's something not right about that. It was driving me crazy the whole movie. And as I was walking out, Son's joint, as I was walking out, all of a sudden it popped into my head, those centaurs aren't walking with a quadruped gait. It's like two guys in a horse suit, where the front and the back limbs were not coordinated with one another. And so I said, that's all right, I'll do an experiment. So I went and I wrote an abstract to an upcoming meeting saying that I was going to have a model of horse gaits. I hadn't learned my lesson from the rigid and non-rigid motion. And it turns out horses have an extra limb than humans do. So they have a hoof, which is an important part of their gait, which is sort of the equivalent of our big toe. And as you add more limbs stacked on one another, the complexity of the motion just goes up exponentially. And I just couldn't deal with that extra limb. So when I went to the meeting, even though the abstract said I was modeling horse gaits, I was modeling human gaits. But that's what sparked this idea. And also the fact is that you can see things like that look like just exactly as you described it. It looks like a gait, but it looks really weird. So how do I distinguish ones that look natural from those which look weird? And moreover, you said it looked like it was walking. Why didn't you say it looked like it was running?
It's going slow.
So the question is, you've got this weird gait that doesn't look like anything you'd ever seen before, but yet you said it's walking. And so the question is, how can we do that? So first thing I did is there is a kind of scientific literature that it's called kinesiology. How many of you have heard of that before? So they do it a lot in sports psychology, where they measure people's motions. It's a lot more sophisticated now than it was back in the 1970s. So in the 70s, they would just track the motions and draw diagrams of what the limbs are actually doing. Nowadays, they have sophisticated models of that, and they can determine, right, are you moving your limbs in the most efficient way possible? So they can, so for swimmers, for example, having the optimized strokes is really important to whether you're going to be a good swimmer or not so good swimmer. So here are the limbs. This is your leg, or not your leg, but an abstract leg. This is a point on the hip. And so what you have is your pelvis is rotating about, I'm sorry, this is the motion of the torso. So your hip is rotating relative to your torso. Your knee is rotating relative to the hip. Your ankle is rotating relative to the knee, and your foot is rotating relative to the lower leg, right? So you've got all these nested patterns of motion. That's what Gunnar Johansson was all excited about when he was doing point light walkers. So if you go into the kinesiology literature, what you see is if you look at the motions of the torso, it's almost a perfect sinusoid, right? So when you walk along like this, your center of gravity is going up and down and up and down, and almost a perfect sinusoidal function. But the phase of those things shifts depending on whether you're walking or whether you're running. If you look at the hip relative to the torso, that's also almost a perfect sinusoidal function. But again, the phases are shifts. So for, this is horizontal motion of the hip is the solid line, and the vertical motion is the dotted line. If you look at the upper leg angle, you get these functions for walking and running. If you look at the lower leg angle, you get these functions for walking and running. And then if you look at the foot, you get something that looks like that. So I built a model of this, and the model, it's sort of two parts. There's what's called in gait, there's the support phase. That's where the leg is in contact with the ground. And then there's called the swing phase, where the leg is not in contact with the ground. And so what I did is I modeled the support phase as a spring, and I modeled the swing phase as a pendulum. All right? And based on that, I developed a pretty complicated model. I mean, it had like 30 parameters, which is why I couldn't do the horse gait, because if you added another limb, that would increase to like 100 parameters. So not going to search through that space. So I set the parameters to try and match the published measured forms of these things, and I was able to get pretty good matches. And you can see if I show you some of the slides. So what gait is this? Let's pick on you again.
Walking.
You have any doubt that it's walking?
No, it looks like walking.
And this kind, it looks like a natural walk, right? That's a really good walk. This was a sufficiently good simulation. There's one of the early video game manufacturers contacted me to try and use this stuff, but nothing ever really came of it. All right, sticking with you, how about this gait?
That definitely looks like running.
How many of you agree this looks like running? Does it look like really accurate running? Now the question is, what is it that distinguishes this from that? Any ideas? So the way I tested this is I did hybrid gaits. So I did every possible combination of running and walking for each limb. All right, so you could have some limbs walking and some limbs running. And I created video displays, had subjects rank whether they look like running or walking. I think this is an example of a hybrid here. As long as I'm picking on you, running or walking. Forced choice, you have to say one.
Speed walking.
But walking.
Yeah, walking.
All right, it turns out that every limb in this gait is running except one. It's at this lower leg right here. So notice when we walk, we land at a sort of extended angle and we kick off not very high. But when we run, we land like that and we kick off much higher. You can see that in this slide here. All right, so this is the lower leg angle. And for walking, your kickoff and land are different angles from what you would do if you were running. And so to follow up on this idea, we did a follow-up experiment where we do the same things we did before, only we could use either the running function and I could move it down, in which case that might make it look like walking, or I could take the walking function and move it up, and that might make it look like running. And I could pair it with either other limbs that were running or walking. And what we discovered was, sure enough, so the open circles, the open circles are the walking gaits. The closed circles are the running gaits. And this is that right? Open circles, open circles walking, running circles running. The solid lines, the other limbs are in agreement. The dotted lines, the other limbs are not in agreement. And here we're just moving the maximum angular displacement. So if you do this, you can take what looks like a walking gait here and change it into a running gait, and vice versa, just by changing the angle of the lower leg. So that's pretty convincing evidence that it's that lower leg that's defining the distinction between running and walking. Now, of course, there are all kinds of other gaits. How would you identify this one? What's that?
Marching.
What kind of marching? Like in a brass band? You can almost see that bass drum. How about this one? It's another kind of marching called goose stepping, a little more ominous. Now I have to tell you the story about the next one. When I was doing this work, I was a postdoc at University of Connecticut, and my advisor was really into running marathons. Have any of you run a marathon before? Well, my advisor, for the first time, he was over 40, so he qualified for the Boston Marathon. So if you go to the Boston Marathon, you see a lot of people with numbers and vastly more people without numbers. And in order to get a number, you have to run a qualifying time in some other marathon. And the qualifying times differ depending on how old you are. And he had qualified for the Boston Marathon. And the marathon had announced they were changing the qualifying times the next year. And he knew damn well he was never going to meet that new qualifying time. So he was determined that he was going to run the Boston Marathon. Unfortunately, 2 weeks before this, he had the flu. So he had flu for 2 weeks. And everybody around him saying, don't run that marathon. but he did. So we went up to Boston, and they start out in a town called Hopkinton. Have you ever been to the Boston Marathon? And then it ends at the Prudential Center, downtown Boston. So his wife and I drive up to one of his old students who lives in Hopkinton, and we watch everybody take off, and he's running the Boston Marathon. And then, about an hour and a half later, we drive into Boston, park the car, and we're watching the people come in as they finish the marathon. Now, what's fascinating about this is that when you look at the first wave of people, the ones who win, they look like they just ran down the driveway. They're not bothered at all by having run 26 miles. And as each wave goes, the people look more and more spent. So after a while, they come in and you see them limping, and and whenever anybody passes by, the audience cheers and they limp a little faster. And then the walking dead start coming in, where they're being helped by other runners because they're determined to finish this race. And we still haven't seen my postdoc advisor. And so his wife says, you got to go down to the medical area and see if he's down there. So I go down to the medical area, and there are people wrapped in like these silver blankets, and some of them are on IVs. I mean, it really looked like a war zone down there. Remember, do any of you know the story of what happened in the guy who ran the very first marathon? He died. He was running, I think, from Athens to Sparta to tell the Spartans that the Athenians had won this major sea battle. And so he announced and collapsed and died. That's where it gets the marathon. That's the Battle of Marathon. So anyway, there's no postdoc advisor. And so this next one, I think it's the next one, was inspired by that event. In fact, I showed this at an international meeting one time when my postdoc advisor was there. I thought he was going to kill me. So here is my postdoc advisor, Bob Shaw, triumphantly crossing the finish line of the Boston Marathon. All right, so what makes this look like it is? What is it about this gait that lets you know it's limping?
One is faster.
Right, it's asymmetrical. Right, so if one leg's really sore, you don't want to spend much time with weight on it. Right, so you'll do, not so exaggerated, but that's basically the idea. So as I said, he said he was going to get me back, but I knew he wouldn't, because this meeting only has 12-minute talks, and my postdoc advisor is just simply incapable of giving a talk in 12 minutes, so I knew I was safe. It's one of the things about graduate advisors and postdoc advisors, you can make fun of them. Particularly easy to do if you work for Dave Woods. I say that with love.
We'll let him know.
Well, my students don't have a problem making fun of me either. All right, let's switch to a different topic. Again, notice here what we're trying to do is understand how we're able to identify different patterns of motion. So in one case, we're talking about rigid and non-rigid motion. Another case, we talk about different kinds of gait. But we can also do this to identify different kinds of slow biological change. Right? So how many times have you seen a friend that you haven't seen, say, in a year or two, and you immediately notice, oh, you lost a ton of weight, in which case you might say something, or you immediately notice, oh my God, you gained 50 pounds, in which case you probably keep that to yourself. Or a friend where, did you get a nose job? So there are all kinds of things that happen over a fairly time scale. Or another thing, imagine you've got some young cousin that you haven't seen in a while, and they've grown 2 feet. So you recognize them as the cousin, but you also recognize that it's not the same cousin you knew the last time because their bodies has developed. Now it turns out that before we had genetics, it was the changes in forms of animals which was the primary source of evidence that biologists used to classify species and how they were related in evolutionary terms. And there's a very famous naturalist, Scottish naturalist, guy by the name of Darcy Wentworth Thompson, and he wrote a book on growth and form. If you ever get a chance to see this, read through it. It's just absolutely beautifully written book. And so he proposed this method of showing how forms change over evolution. So what you do is you put a grid over one species and you mark the coordinates of different features. And then you distort the grid over another one so that the corresponding features are at similar coordinates. And then this change in the shape of the grid is one way of characterizing how the shape of the species has evolved as it goes from one version to another. And here are examples of this. These are right out of Thompson's book for a number of different fish. He does the same thing for the human skull, skull of a chimpanzee, skull of a baboon. So this, if you were to deform a human skull into a chimpanzee, you'd have distortion like so. Notice the jaw's getting much bigger, but the cranium is getting smaller, and even more so when you go to the baboon. And here's his example of a young man versus an old man. Now, it turns out my postdoc advisor, Bob Shaw, was very interested in this and developed a whole research program on it. And when he came to, in fact, it was very lucky for me, I probably wouldn't be in the field. So he came to University of Connecticut right when I was getting my PhD. But when I got my PhD, I didn't have any publications. There's no way I would have gotten a job. But he then hired me as a postdoc for 3 years. And then at the end of that time, I was much more ready to go out in the market. And so I was working on trying to understand how you tell the difference between the head of a young kid and the head of an older kid. That's what we were working on. And so I started doing some research on this, and I discovered that there is a law called Wolff's Law. This will be important for the next few slides to understand. It turns out that bone grows in proportion to how much pressure is on it. All right? So if you think of the head, what part of your head has more pressure than other parts of the head? So the bottom has more pressure? Or were you just rubbing your chin?
Thinking.
All right, top of your head has no pressure at all. There's nothing on top of it. So as you get lower in the body, right, it's supporting more and more weight. There's more and more pressure. And just as a general rule, because of Wolff's Law, the body, as you grow from infancy to adulthood, the lower the part of the body is, the more it grows relative to all the other parts. And so if you think about the head, so the way I tried to model this is think of the head as a water balloon. And so you have, you can measure the pressure at each point on a sphere. And the idea is that if you look at how head grows, it would be proportional to how much pressure there is. And if you do that, you get an equation that looks like this, which I'm not going to go through the details of it, but the form of this equation is what's called a cardioid. Cardioid is a heart shape. So this equation transforms a circle into a heart, or something like a heart. And here's what it looks like. This is so cool. I was so enamored by this. How many of you have heard of the magazine Scientific American? It was much more popular back in the 80s than it is now. And in fact, a lot of classes would use Scientific American Review articles in lieu of textbooks. And I had the idea that, gee, I wonder if they'd be interested in this. And so I wrote a short paper and sent it off to Scientific American, and then everybody in the department said, no, you can't do that. They only invite papers. And so a couple of weeks later, I got a letter back saying, hey, yeah, we love your paper, we'll publish it, and here's $1,400. Right? Now, this is 1980, $1,400 is worth a lot more then than it is now, which I did not share with my co-authors. So here's the idea. Here you have see the inner one look like the shape of a young kid, and the outer one doesn't. So this is going through that transformation of what happens as a young kid grows, right? You get a lot of movement of the skull, much more at the bottom of the head than you do at the top. Now, if you reverse the sign of that equation, you also get something that looks like evolution. So this would be like a Cro-Magnon man or something like that. Notice when they depict spacemen, how do they always do that? If some futuristic creature comes down to Earth, they all have these big heads, right? Well, that's just a natural progression of this to that. Let's skip that. So the first experiment we did a whole bunch of transformations. This is actual growth. This is the model that I developed. And these are a bunch of other models to compare it to. And if you look at so we actually do tracing of real heads at different ages, and we compare my model to it, it fits really well, right? So it's a pretty good model perceptually. Now remember, what do we say about transformational invariants? They apply to different entities. So now we ask the question, well, what would happen if you applied it to other kinds of things that aren't human? Like maybe a dog. So which one looks like a puppy, the top or the bottom? That looks like a puppy, that looks like a mature dog. Which one looks like a baby chimp? This one or that one? Top one? Which looks like a baby bird? This one or that one? Right? These are all applying the same transformation that we developed for human heads. But now let's get weird. Let's apply it to a car. Young Volkswagen, old decrepit Volkswagen. Young Volkswagen, old decrepit Volkswagen. Cartoonists do this all the time. They're aware of these featural changes. So even the oldest Disney cartoon, the Tugboat Somebody, did in the 30s, there's a mama tugboat and a bunch of little baby tugboats. If you look at the shapes of those things, they change the shapes in a way that's consistent with this. So here's getting fancy. This is a photograph of my postdoc's son. Unfortunately, just died recently. And I worked out this technique where you could take a photograph and then transform people. So here I moved him forward in time. Here I moved him back in time. And I used to do this to all the graduate students in the department. Now, one thing the model doesn't account for is there's part of it accounts for the heart tissue growth, but especially in males, our noses grow about 10 times more than the rest of the face does. So if I take a photo of you, right, and then I apply this transform to it, I would get a little kid with a mustache and beard and this big honking nose that looks absolutely hideous and disgusting. And so I had plastered all over my lab. I had pictures of all the other graduate students in the department. They would resist mightily my taking their pictures so that I could transform them in this way. We also hooked up with a company so we could do this with a bust. And here's the cool part. We actually found a database. So this is my first grant from the National Institute of Dental Research to actually predict the growth of craniums. So we found this study that was done at the University of Connecticut Medical School. I can't believe they did this, but basically what they did is they took kids starting in the 40s and they took x-rays of them, their heads, twice a year for every year until their 20s. So you could go there and, I could get here's an x-ray of the head at 2, here's the x-ray of the head at 6, here's the x-ray of the head at 12, here's the x-ray of the head at 20. And so this is the x-ray of the skull of a young kid. The outer one is the x-ray of the skull at, say, age 20. And the dotted line is our transformation of this thing onto that thing. And so this is my one publication in the American Journal of Dental Research. We're a perceptual psychologist, and we got a huge grant to study this, which kept me employed for 3 years until I got a real job. Now again, Wolff's Law doesn't just apply to heads, it also applies to bodies. So if you look at a kid, right, they got a big head relative to the torso. Adult has a small head relative to the torso from the same underlying biological process. And so we did an experiment where we used a bunch of drawings that look like this, and then we said, all right, let's say we try it with Martians or robots or flowers. Had one of my postdocs actually found this paper, reprint of it in a file cabinet up in my lab, and he comes down to my office, and he's got this reprint with this figure. And he goes, Jim, this really inspires me. And I said, well, why is that? He said, if you can publish that, you can publish anything. So you might think this is ridiculous. And then well, to make matters worse, we walked the subjects into a room and we just said, how old is that Martian? Right? So they'd write down years. I mean, this is a totally ridiculous task. And you might think, well, if you do that, you're just going to get a noisy mess. But we had lots of subjects and we averaged them together, and look at how the data look. Here's the human. That's a huge correlation, folks. You don't get that in social psychology. The Martian, the robot, doesn't really work for the flower. And the reason for that is flowers grow the opposite way as humans do. So the head gets bigger for the flower with age rather than smaller. All right, so that gets us to an even older type of research. This is by a French psychologist. The guy's name is Albert Michaud. He published a book in 1946 called The Perception of Causality. And what he was interested in is if you see a display like this, naive observers will say, why did that blue ball move? And they say the blue ball moved because it was hit by the red ball. The red ball caused the blue ball to move. And so Michaud was really interested in this idea that you can look at a pattern of motion and get high consensus on who caused what to do what. And I'll show you a bunch of examples of this. So here's an example where most observers report that the center square is pulling the others. This one they report that the blue circle is smashing the red square. And that gets us to a very famous cartoon by Hyder and Simmel. Have any of you taken a course in social psychology? Did they cover attribution theory in social psychology? Tell me about attribution theory.
It's when you attribute different people's behavior to their, depending either on their personality or on external factors.
Exactly. You know the guy who invented attribution theory? It's this guy here, Fritz Heider. And this is Marianne Simmel. I was actually on the faculty with Marianne Simmel at my first job. She was retiring just as I was arriving. So I'm going to show you a film, and I'll ask you to describe it since you described attribution theory. So watch this thing and then just describe. Did they show you this film in your class? Good. Has anybody seen this film before? What was the context?
Human-centered automation and systems thinking.
Ah, okay. Ah, where's my cursor? There it is. We need the soundtrack. Do, 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 do. This is my favorite part coming up. Okay, tell me what you saw.
The big triangle is in the little square, and then it comes out and it starts attacking the smaller triangle, and then it goes back in, and because the circle's been kind of cowering the whole time in fear. And then
Can you identify genders to any of them?
I guess stereotypically, though, it's a woman who's kind of in the background, and then it's this kind of scary guy triangle that's coming out and attacking the other.
And then what happens after he finishes off the little triangle?
Then he goes back in to attack the circle, and then
But notice his attack movements are quite different.
yeah, it's much more.
So in the one he's being aggressive, and the other he's sort of
Yeah, it's much
trying to
sneaky.
corner.
Yeah.
And then she gets away.
Yeah, and then she gets away, and then he and then he gets angry that they've both gotten away from him, and so that's when he comes back in and kind of smashes the.
Did anybody interpret that film in a different way than how she described it? What did you see?
It was like a mom chasing her two kids, and the two kids were fighting. That's how I looked at it.
Oh, I can see that. But all the same emotions can apply,
I guess.
right?
Yeah.
Mom gets pissed off because the kids get away from her.
Yeah.
So here's the thing to note about this. Notice not everything in this film is perceived as animate, all right? So the flap moves, but you don't see it as an animate thing, right? Just the triangles and circles. And you can perceive the motives. So the big triangle's being aggressive to the other little figures. And the other little figures are afraid and they try to get away. And then the big triangle gets frustrated and smashes the house. Now let's go back to what she said about attribution theory. Why don't you tell it again?
It's the difference between whether you attribute someone's behavior to their personality and their personality flaws, or an external situation that's making them.
Well, that's one aspect of attribution theory. But
What
the
you
thing is that you attribute motives to other people. That's the main aspect of it. But now here's the question for you. Why would you attribute motives to a triangle?
Because it seems animate when it's up there.
So again, if you're a social psychology, it's that attribution that pops out. If you're a perceptual psychologist, the thing that pops up is you could show this in any country in the world and they'll tell you the same story. You can show it to little kids, they'll tell you the same story. You show it to schizophrenic patients, they'll tell you the same story. They might elaborate in sort of weird ways. Everybody sees this in exactly, or not exactly this, but in largely the same way. So there's something about these patterns of motion that forces you to interpret the scene the way that you are. Those attributions aren't coming from inside of you. They're being imposed on you by the pattern of motion. I described this once to one of my social psychology colleagues, and he was just mystified. How could you think of it that way? And I kept asking him, why would you attribute motives to a triangle? He didn't have an answer. So again, historically, this is very important because this was the basis of, as I said, attribution theory. Yeah.
So, how did humans develop that idea that, like you said, based on motion, we perceive a motive or emotions, etc.? Where did we develop that or learn that throughout our?
To the extent that we learn it, it's a pretty early age. There is some developmental work on this stuff. Early on, kids are pretty clueless, but by 4, they get this pretty easily. Now you say, well, what is it that's driving it? We don't know. There are lots of demonstrations of these phenomena. There are not many explanations of it.
But you think it's because of the motion?
I say it's because of what?
You think it's because of the motion pattern, or the pattern of motion?
It's clearly the pattern of motion. If you play this backward, you don't get anything remotely like what she said. I have a backwards version, but I didn't show it. So this is really defining. This is like the ultimate. If you could explain this, you'd really have event perception down. And there are a few studies on this stuff. They're done by social psychologists, so they're not very good. The perceptual psychologists gave up for the most part because they couldn't even figure out how to code the motions. So there's a big lapse where there wasn't any research until recently. Yeah.
So I don't know if this is even a valid question, but early in the semester you talked about bottom-up and top-down processing and perception and how you're mostly bottom-up. What is this? How is this bottom-up?
I would say this is bottom-up. If you were an attribution theorist, you'd say it's top-down.
Okay.
And the reason why I say it's bottom-up, I mean, it's not a foolproof argument, but it's that there's so much consensus of everybody. So if it were top-down, right, maybe it was some really general thing that's common to all cultures in the world that would lead you to do these top-down attributions. Or maybe, more likely, it's something that is built into you. How many of you have pets? Dog?
Dog.
What does your dog do when animated figures are on TV?
I don't know, nothing.
My dog jumps up and barks like crazy.
Really?
Yeah. Drives me and my wife crazy, yeah.
Yeah, my dog never really pays attention to the TV that much, but one night my mom and sister were watching the movie Uncle Buck that came on the TV, and he barked at Uncle Buck for the entire screen time. He never paid any attention other than that.
So my dog barks at other dogs in movies.
What about the doorbell in movies?
Oh, doorbell in movie drives her crazy. But she also, that stupid paper rabbit that some investment house uses.
Oh, yeah.
My dog sees those things, she just goes crazy. Right? So she sees motion all the time, but those she's seeing is animate. That's another piece of evidence that's telling me there's something more primitive than that, than I'm imposing my life experiences on this thing. But we could argue about that. As I say, my social psych colleagues would tell me, would say this is apostasy. All right, let me cover you a couple of other demos and then I'll let you go. This is a wonderful study by Gao, Newman, and Scholl. Brian Scholl is a psychologist at Yale, and he does this work sort of as a sideline, but the stuff he does is really good. So imagine, here's the problem. Suppose you're a wolf, and you're going to try and catch a sheep. So how should you go about moving? What do you not want to happen?
I don't want to or alert the sheep that I'm coming.
You don't want to alert the sheep that you're coming. And how might you go about that?
Either sneak up from behind or corner the sheep in a way that reduces the paths it can take.
Okay, so this is the game that Scholl set up, or that Gao, Newman, and Scholl. Gao probably is the one who did the work. So you could have a wolf that just runs right at the sheep, but then that telegraphs to the sheep, this wolf's coming at you, and they try to get away. Or you could randomize your directions a little bit, but still have the average be in the direction of the sheep. Or you could completely randomize the directions, in which case you'd never catch the sheep. So here's the idea. This is where the you're going to try and identify which of these circles is the wolf. So who's being chased and who's doing the chasing? Right? Could you all identify the chaser and the chasee? Let's do this one again. All right, so he's the chaser, and this is the guy being chased. Actually, I don't think that's right. I must have got it wrong. That's supposed to be a 0-degree heat-seeking wolf. But anyway, let's put a little more variability in there. This is a 30-degree variation in the wolf's behavior. And then finally, let's do 60. All right, take it back, 90. Cursor, where are you? There you are. Okay, now if you look at performance on this task, this is the detection accuracy. So if you have 0-degree variation in the trajectory of the wolf relative to the sheep, subjects get it almost 90% of the time. And as the subtlety goes up, so there's more variation in the wolf's direction relative to the sheep, then the detection accuracy goes down. But now there's a bit of a trade-off here, because if you have too much, you won't catch the wolf. And so what they did in this case is I can't show you a thing because it's a video game that is played. So you are the sheep, and there's a wolf. You control the sheep, and your job is don't get caught. And so here's what, so this is chasing subtlety. That means how much variation is there in the direction of the wolf. If it's a heat seeking wolf, so it only moves in one direction. The sheep escapes 60% of the time. As the subtlety goes up, the success of the wolf goes up, and the sheep only escapes about 25% of the time. This is a dangerous wolf. This is an obvious wolf. But then if you increase it still further, the success rate goes up because this is an incompetent wolf. So here we have, right, the wolf doing one thing, and now you're the subject trying to escape this wolf. And depending on the subtlety of the wolf, you're sometimes able to do it and sometimes not able to do it. Now I'm going to show you one last display, and then I'll let you go. So the other thing they were interested in, and this bears to the Heider-Simmel film, the idea that in some cases you have some figures that have an orientation to them. Like the triangle has an orientation to it, whereas circles do not. So would that make any difference in judging whether you're being chased or not? And so what they did is they would always they'd have a circle that has no orientation. You could have an oriented dart where the dart is always pointing toward the thing that's being chased. You have a misoriented dart or a perpendicular dart. And what happens is in the orientation, the oriented darts, the subjects are much more successful in escaping the wolf because it gives them a cue as to what the wolf is all about. Now here's another interesting phenomenon called the wolf pack effect. I'm going to show you two displays. There's no chasing going on at all. So in both cases, the triangles are moving completely randomly. They have absolutely nothing to do with that green dot. But let's look at the two examples and you can see how they're perceived differently. So in this case, it just looks like the arrows are just milling around and not directly interacting with the green dot at all. But let's see what happens if I alter the orientation. So to keep the motion exactly the same. All right, now if you're that green dot, you would feel very uncomfortable. But again, the motion is completely random, exactly as it was in the previous one. The only thing that's different in these two cases is the orientation of the dart relative to the green circle. All right, well, I've hopefully given you a taste of what event recognition is like. There are hundreds of examples of this one could study. Jim Davis over in computer science and I once did a film where we had people act out different scenarios and ask subjects to identify them. One of my favorites was this game called Monkey in the Middle. Have any of you ever heard of that? Right, so let's say you and I are tossing a ball and try and prevent you from getting it. So the interesting thing is, you and I are tossing the ball back and forth, but everybody notices that you're part of the game, even though you never touched the ball. All right, so the question is, how would people determine that? And we did stalking and helping and all kinds of other things. I don't think anything actually came of it, but it was an interesting exercise. All right, have a good weekend. I will see you on Monday, and we will switch gears and talk about optical flow and the control of navigation, and I promise I'll have your test back on Tuesday.